All right, I think we are live now. Just trying to get my pages sorted here. All right. Hello, everybody. My name is Maddie. I am a server here at Three Vikings, and I'm an English student, creative writing minor. Very excited to sit here with Mark Allard-Will, who is the author of Secret Dragon Slayer, which we've been selling here at the restaurant. The graphic novel series. And we're going to ask him some questions about his process of the reimagining of the Völsunga series. Here is a copy of that. And Mark, how about you start off by telling us a little bit about yourself and how you came to find this Norse mythology and your love for it, I guess.
Yeah, for sure. Firstly, thanks for having me. Really appreciate it. And thank you, Edmonton, for joining and watching. So for me, how I came to kind of fall in love with the Völsunga Saga was a long process of essentially falling in love with mythology as a young child. And I remember that moment quite clearly, and it was Norse mythology as well. And it was, I'm sure everybody remembers back before the internet, or before the internet really took off at least, when we all had the kind of family hardbound encyclopedias. I remember asking my mum where the days of the week came from, and she cracked open one of the encyclopedias, and I saw these like beautiful illustrations of the Norse gods, and I was just blown away with pagan mythology from that moment onwards. There's something about, for me, the idea of all these different Norse gods and gods of different forms of paganism as well, like Mayan paganism and Aztec, where the gods have these real strong personalities that really captivates me. And so when it came round to my 20s, I kind of picked up the Völsunga Saga, or a translation of it, I should say, and I read it from cover to cover, and I was just blown away. I could see the Hobbit in there, and I was like, I'm certain this is what Tolkien took inspiration from. So I researched into it, and I was right. And I could see it in there. Fafnir the dragon is Smaug. You've got Gollum, who comes from Reagan. You've got all of these different characters that translate over, and of course, Anvaranort, the ring, becomes the One Ring. So it really captivated me, and that's what made me want to translate this into something that's much more accessible, which is a graphic novel.
I absolutely love that, like, your explanation of like cracking into family encyclopedias and like that stemming your love for it and like your family carrying that on. Like, my background is in British and American literature, and my kind of finding for it was the same way. Like, my grandmother had all these bookshelves of encyclopedias, and like sitting down with her, and my memories of the very beginning of my love for that is very similar. So I love that.
That's fantastic.
I guess what I kind of want to focus on next is your process of, reading everything growing up. What made you want to make this a graphic novel and not just like another written novel of information? What was your pull towards the graphic side of it?
So this was something that I really wanted to write from. So I'm 35 now. It's something that I really wanted to write from about the age of 28, was when it really took me that this was the myth that I really wanted to modernize and turn into a visual 3-act story. But the reason for a graphic novel is it's kind of the medium that I love to write in. And again, that goes back to my childhood as well. I fell in love with comic books at a really young age. For me, it was when I used to go out with my dad in what we call lorries in the UK. But now that I'm a Canadian citizen, I should probably say trucks. But going out with my dad in the lorry, if we were stopped for a night out somewhere, like because there's driver hour limits in the UK and across much of the European Union. So if we stopped somewhere because there weren't enough driver hours to come back, Dad would buy me like a copy of like the Beano or the Dandy, which are like British comedy comics. And so I was probably like 4 or 5 when this was first happening. And then when I turned about 9 or 10, that was when Sonic the Hedgehog really exploded everywhere. So we had Sonic Mania, which was the nickname given to it at the time. But so there was this British licensed version of the comic book for Sonic, which was called Sonic the Comic, which is different to the Archie Sonic the Hedgehog comics. I was absolutely obsessed with them and would get them every fortnight or 14 days when they came out.
Every kid and adult in the 90s was loving that.
So as an adult, I had really no intention of writing for comic books originally, and I had studied for film at university in High Wycombe in England, and I had got really deep into that, and I'd started filmmaking after university and done some paid gigs where I did like music videos for like really small record labels and stuff like that. But I felt my heart kind of waning from it. So after I moved to Canada 7-8 years ago now, a year later I met my wife, Elaine and Will, and she was already a comic book producer, a comic book artist and writer, and she was making works such as Look Straight Ahead, which has gone on to win a couple of awards. And it was kind of seeing her work and seeing that, oh wow, you can actually tell a story that's exactly like a film. And I guess I shouldn't have been surprised by that growing up with comic books, but I was surprised at how easier it is to kind of apply yourself to that than it is to film. With film, it just feels like there are so many hurdles to jump through. And there are hurdles in comics, like don't get me wrong. So, but one thing I really observed after writing my first couple of graphic novels before Siegfried Dragonslayer was the fact that people relate to comics so much easier. And one thing I'd missed since kind of leaving comics as a kind of young teenager and coming back in my late 20s was that such a wider spread of the population have picked up comics since. The idea of it being a kid thing has just vanished. And
Totally.
and it keeps vanishing day by day more and more because of things like the Marvel Cinematic Universe, the DCEU, stuff like that. And there's a big first. One thing that really surprised me is there's a big first for stuff that is outside of the superhero realm. There's a hunger for actual stories told just in a comic book instead. So I read this myth, and like I say, I felt like the Völsunga Saga, it's such a beautiful myth, and I could see that it is what Tolkien took a lot of leanings from for The Hobbit. But I was kind of worried that it just sticks to this stuffy world of academia, because the more people I spoke to about it, they were like, what's the Völsunga Saga?
It was like, once I got it into my hands and I started kind of researching things about it, it was very difficult for me to find, like, even to order your recommended readings that you have listed in the foreword of your book. Like, it was hard to get my hands on.
And there are so many translations of it as well. And another thing that makes that even more confusing, you got ones like William Morris's translation from like, when was that, 1890 something, where he has kind of confused the Nibelungenlied, Das Nibelungenlied, with the Völsunga Saga. So you've got a German version of the myth which has some very altered characters. Then you've got the Völsunga Saga, and he hasn't made distinctions between which one is which. Things like that make it even harder for the public to access it. So my fear was that this is going to be lost to the public, and it will remain only in the stuffy world of academia if somebody doesn't translate it into a medium that is readily accessible, such as film, such as comics. and comics are so close to film anyway. And the other thing that I should probably touch upon that makes it difficult is you read in the translation of something that is poetic stanza from a language that predates even Proto-Icelandic. So you're talking about Old Norse, but it was then written down into Proto-Icelandic, translated into modern Icelandic, then translated into English.
Mm-hmm.
So just taking it out of that completely, taking it out of stanza, putting it into a 3-act story, I just felt like that would be the way to make it readily accessible to the public.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and speaking of, I guess, video and stuff, you have a clip, a little trailer of the book. I think that we can play just to kind of give anybody watching a better idea of what everything looks like and the feeling that the graphic novel gives you. So if you want to go ahead and...
For sure, yeah.
Cue that up.
Impulsive young Prince Siegfried, mission from his aloof parents, the King and Queen of Denmark, starting a war with the neighbouring country and seeking out the most feared dragon in the realm seems like a good place to start. An epic tale full of action, adventure, mythological beasts, magic swords, powerful rings, and a treacherous companion. A reimagining of the Völsunga Saga, Siegfried, Dragon Slayer, utilizes beautiful coffee-painted illustrations by Jasmine Redford to breathe new life into the myth that partially inspired J.R.R. Tolkien's The Hobbit.
Will Siegfried succeed? There's only one way to find out. All right, so we're back.
All right, so anybody watching that doesn't have a copy of it already at home, it gives you a better idea kind of what we're talking about, of the way that the illustration works. Like the cross hatching is beautifully well done. Jasmine did a great job on that, and the coffee coloring too. I would love to hear about your process with Jasmine, I guess, and how, because it took, like 2 years for everything to come together?
Yeah, I mean, if you tally the whole book up, from my having the concept and building it out into how I wanted to reimagine the story into that kind of graphic novel, visual medium, 3-act story, right the way to it being published, it's ultimately ends up being just shy of 4 years. 2.5 years of that was our process, and that's just because of how long it takes to kind of create a page with coffee coloring in it, with all that ink wash as well. Sorry,
didn't mean to cut you off. Is your process for that like writing it almost as like a novel and then taking your pieces and pairing it to photos, or are you kind of sketching and writing yourself?
So I haven't done any of the artwork. I haven't, no concept sketches, nothing. So I literally write in a very surgical manner that's very similar to a screenplay. So it's full script, and you might have heard of people talk about like the Alan Moore script or the Alan Moore process of writing, where it's not just like short descriptions, but he fully fleshes out, this is what I want each and every panel to look like. And so the script is broken down. If you imagine, instead of like on a screenplay where you have action, so you have, the scene heading, action, then character description, their dialogue, then back to action. Instead of it being broken down by scene heading, which is location, it's broken down instead by page and panel. So I write everything very surgically. This is exactly how, and it does help to have that education in screenwriting and in film, to have that kind of mind's eye of how to see things. But that's not a limitation for other people to come into this method of writing, for sure. Like, there are so many resources on how to learn how to do that anyway, without needing to go to university, without all of these things. But yeah, I write a very surgical script, describe everything that I want to see and the dialogue. I then went to an editor in Toronto virtually through, hiring her to work on my script, Susan Hughes, and she kind of gave me back all these notes on how to better my script, I guess. Then I would send that along to Jasmine, and the process would begin with getting her to do concept sketches of the characters, of locations, based upon the descriptions that are in the script. And then there might be a little bit of a back and forth on perhaps we can just tweak up this little thing or that little thing. Mostly it was fine because I'd chosen Jasmine for her art style for this, and I had that in my mind's eye of this is what I wanted her work for. Because she is so unique with that coffee painting. And
do you think having Dragon Slayer kind of set up already as a screenplay, do you think we might get a little cartoon film or short of this one day?
I think that would be great if that happened, but I never really kind of go into these things hoping that somebody's going to come along and adapt this.
Mm-hmm.
What I would hope is that somebody would have the same mission in their something that they hold really close to their heart, the same as what I did, of like, let's try and get mythology that has like which I find it really sad when it slips out of public consciousness. Let's try and get it back to the people, and like if somebody came along to adapt it with that sentiment in mind, I would absolutely love that if somebody did that. But it's one of those things that, for me, working with Jasmine, the process was just I got her to do all those concept sketches, and then we just went straight into the finished artwork from there. And the reason it took so long is she has to do pencils, she has to come over it with inks, let those inks dry, then do coffee. She has to let one pass of coffee dry, do a second pass, let that dry, a third pass, and that's the maximum. Apparently, she's told me that doesn't take any more after that third pass. So it will only get as dark as that third pass. And then she has to come over it with ink wash, let that dry. So when you see those heavy greys in the panels as well, that's ink wash. And so that's like a 3 or 4 day process per page.
Wow, jeez.
Yeah.
After reading through the Jesse Byock, the the translation of that version, like I found a quote that it very much like matched your forward. That was just him talking about the goal throughout has been to produce a very accurate and readable translation of this important medieval text, which you completely agree with too, as you said. How much of your process on Dragon Slayer was important to maintain like the very core storyline? Because I know you mentioned about editing certain things and like kind of keeping it PG, and what were the core pieces that needed to be kept for you to make it feel like it was an accurate reproduction?
So for me, one of the big things that I wanted to make sure I maintained was the overall flow of the story. I obviously wanted to connect things as well. Like I wanted there to be a feeling of that you're connected between where The Hobbit ended up, from where Tolkien took his leanings from, and the original source mythology, and I wanted to kind of connect those two things. That was also part of the reason I chose Jasmine. I saw Jasmine's artwork probably 5 years ago now at a friend's party, and she was a very shy person about her artwork, and I'm glad that I managed.
Almost all artists are.
Yeah, and I'm glad I managed to pull her out of her shell and get her to do this book, because her artwork needs to be seen by people. Yeah. And I saw it, and it's this real fantasy, strong artwork, and I thought, oh, that would be perfect. It could connect these two things. The other thing that I really wanted to look at is what can I get away with changing and reimagining to have my own voice on it, with it still being very true to the core of the original myth. And I did that with, of course, renaming Sigurd, because the main character is called Sigurd in the original Norse text, renaming him to Siegfried. And there's a few reasons for that. One is that we find it easier as English speakers to connect with a Germanic name than we do, unfortunately, and I don't mean to be rude to anybody, but to most other European languages. I mean, you can argue that's because English comes from West Frisian and whatever, but it's not necessarily true. It's just that we've got a strong link to Germany. And historically, English has a strong link to the German-ish languages. But it's another reason was actually the logo of the book, which is, I know that sounds weird to say, but if you have Sigurd, which is a really short name, trying to fit Dragon Slayer as one line underneath that to keep it as...
Yeah,
do you see what I mean? Like, so yeah, like you can see on screen there, if you try to just do Sigurd, which is just 5 letters, you're not going to be able to pull off having Dragon Slayer quite succinctly underneath that. So I know that's a weird reason to do that, but the main reason was it's easier for an English speaker to connect with Siegfried than it is Sigurd. And the other reason, there's a third reason as well, which it brings it all round in a succinct, nice circle, which is that there is, of course, there's Nibelungenlied as well, which is the German equivalency and German adaptation of the Völsunga Saga. And it's argued as to which one came first, and I honestly don't know which one came first. I've tried to look into it, but there's because pagans up until a certain point, ancient pagans didn't like to write things down.
There's so much text that, as I was going through it, like that's not even readable anymore, and that we don't even have access to, and it's quite devastating.
Yeah, and because of that, we don't know which one came first. But anyway, Das Nibelungenlied, which is a version of this from Germany, went on to obviously inspire Richard Wagner's. In English, it's called the Ring Cycle. Der Ring something in German. I can't remember, but it went on to inspire that as well. So, and in Das Nibelungenlied and in Richard Wagner's play, he is called Siegfried. So connecting all of those things together, I decided to change that as well. So yeah, figuring out what to have my own stamp on. There's also things like changing up how Fafnir dies. He still dies in the same method in the graphic novel, but it's meant to be, because there's a lot of humor in Norse mythology, and it seems to be that he has this one big long diatribe in all translations of the Völsunga Saga on his final breath, and it seems to be this joke of like, how can somebody say all of this in one breath? Like this very self-aware, because it would have been performed by a bard or a poet in mead halls across, all the different tribes of the Viking Age. And the idea of a poet performing this, it would have been comedic, it would have been funny in this otherwise quite sad poem and play. And I decided that should change, and because we're going for a filmic medium, it should be something very action-packed and something that's going to keep people on the edge of their seats, and that's kind of what I went with in my adaptation as well. So what did I have a hand in it and try to change? It was, like you say, trying to PG-ify things. There is, unfortunately, a little bit of familiar side in the original translations, in the original text. And I decided that should come out because it was familial side of people under the age of 18, which,
you can still, get the crucial point of the story across, and your character development still moves along the same way without it.
Yeah, absolutely. And then, the other main thing, like I say, is changing the name to Siegfried, but keeping all the other names and characters the same. And keeping the intention of who Sigurd is as Siegfried just the same anyway. So that was really my stamp on what this became as a graphic novel.
Mm-hmm. So I guess my questions now kind of go more into the content of it, especially as like a new person into the mythology for it. I did as much digging as I could, and save some questions for you to kind of tell me your interpretation of it, I guess. And sorry for my pronunciation on any of
Oh,
these
no worries.
names. I'm sure you encounter that a lot. But in your fight scene where King Lingi,
Yeah, I think that's pronounced Lingi. Yeah.
Lingi, okay. He brings a sacrifice to Odin, and then that's where Odin kind of comes in and aids him in the destroying of Gram and King Sigmund. What was the sacrifice there?
So I'm not sure what sacrifices would have been in the Viking Age. And there's lots of argument as to whether human sacrifice was included.
Mm-hmm.
But we know for sure that post-Roman pagan cultures, and like the Vikings are weird, by the way, because they, as much as I love the Viking mythology and stuff like that, it's so odd that they existed so late after Christianity had already taken over all of Western Europe. Because Rome fell, with the fall of Rome, Christianity came through, and that was it. Everyone was Christianized.
Yeah.
And for some reason, they just appeared out of. I guess Christianity didn't make it to Scandinavia, of course, but then they took paganism back with them across the places that had already become Christianized. But what we know from post-Roman paganism is that they did for sure sacrifice animals, and there were different kinds of animals for different kinds of events. So, for example, we know that things like boars and stags were sacrificed for protection in warfare and stuff like that. So I personally think, because it would have been a war event with King Lingi going up against Sigmund, which is Sigurd's father, that it would have been a boar.
All right.
Yeah.
And then another part of that scene that I was really curious to know about, I don't know if this is going to follow up in later parts, but how was Sigmund able to predict that it was Joris was pregnant with a son? Because I know Odin's intervention, like his divine intervention and fertility, fruits of fertility kind of thing, like was that kind of Odin intervening to make sure that the bloodline goes along, to make sure that there is a dragon slayer?
That one, I couldn't really interpret that too well from the mythology. And what I believe it's meant to signify, in my personal belief of how I read it and how I interpreted it, is that it's meant to be that the Völsung family is just so just so gosh darn masculine and so divine that he just knows that there's going to be this divine son who comes along
and carries on the line.
But clearly what he doesn't anticipate is the tragedy as well that comes.
I think what I found myself wondering, I guess even now, like your process of the whole thing being, loving this for your whole life, and the book being anywhere from 2 to 4 years to put together. Are you tired of the content now? Like, I know, like when you work with something you love, it doesn't feel like something you love anymore, and you start to kind of feel like it's work, and you lose the interest for it a little bit. But are you feeling exhausted, or do you have the same excitement that you started with?
Well, I mean, yes and no. Like, I still completely love the source mythology, and now that the book has come out and I've started hearing feedback, and I always kind of expect the worst, and maybe that's the writer part of me, maybe that's just me as a person. And I've had books that have come out before that weren't received as well, and this book has just been received so well, and I'm really thankful to, well, firstly to anybody who does buy it through Three Vikings and anyone who enjoyed it. But I got that feedback that's coming back, and it's just seems to be really, really positive, and that's a really big step up, because all the feedback coming up is saying that this is kind of my best work yet, from people that have read my previous work. And so
yeah, we have people coming into the restaurant asking, like, the advertising for it is very well done. Like, it's been very, very well received here.
Awesome, thank you. But yeah, it's so I went into it expecting the worst just before the book published, and I won't lie to you, I always kind of disliked my work after I finished it. It's just, I don't know, I hear other writers say that as well. Like, I don't pick up one of my books and read them until a few years has passed.
Yeah.
Like, I will reread my script to help with that editorial process once I've got an editor on board, of course. But after I've been so close to it for so long, I just want to like push it out and just get rid of it. So I went into it kind of like disliking my work after it had finished, like I do with every book.
Mm-hmm.
And then being completely like just a nervous ball of wreck just before, a nervous wreck just before the book released. And then when it did release, once I started getting this positive feedback, I was like, oh, maybe this is
not so hard.
Yeah,
it's not so bad.
it's not so bad. So the love for it has kind of come back, and I'm really excited for book 2, which is going to be the final part of it. So it's just going to be a 2-book series. But yeah, I still love it.
I'm excited for, because the ending is, anybody who reads it will definitely be buying the second one.
Yeah, thank you.
See where it goes. That kind of also brings me to Miller's questions. Miller is a 9-year-old who read your comic in the last week, and his first question is, when is part 2 coming out? Obviously. And I would kind of like to add to that, just saying, can you tell us about your writing process and like the fashion of, like, did you write everything as a whole, or did you just write the first part and now you're working on the second part?
Yeah, I did just write the first part originally, so I've still got to finish the script for part 2.
Mm-hmm.
Work on that's begun. This one is going to be, I would like to hope that it's 2 years down the line that we'll see it published.
Mm-hmm.
I would like to hope that it could be a little bit longer. Unfortunately, those things aren't necessarily set in stone right at this early stage of beginning book 2. And just because of how much time and money it takes to produce a graphic novel, and this one was supported by the Saskatchewan Arts Board, which helped me to kind of fund the art process and to pay for Jasmine's page rate so that she could have that living expenses covered for that period of time.
Mm-hmm.
That kind of all takes, once that process kind of begins, that's when things kind of become a bit more concrete and firm up. Once we get through the art process and get closer to have the discussions with the publisher.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, for now,
I'll sell as many copies as I can here to make it come out faster.
yeah, thank you. But yeah, I would like to hope 2 years down the line.
And then Miller was also wondering, what metal is the sword made out of? So Graham, can you dive into any kind of material or magical knowledge about the sword and its history that you know about?
Yeah, I know what you mean with Graham, but I'm not sure. I think it's meant to be, I've seen illustrations of it pictured as gold. It's not meant to be a natural gold. I think it's meant to be some kind of divine gold of Asgard. Sorry, not Asgard, that's Earth. Why can't I think of the name? The Asia, the gods. It's meant to be
something out of our realm of creation.
Yeah, so it's meant to be something that's a gold style product of the gods, and because there's also Gleipnir, the spear that Odin breaks ground with, which is made out of the same material, which is always which is described as being gold, or at least gold in color. So it's some kind of like divine, I guess heavenly, given that it's paganism is maybe the wrong word, but definitely a godly realm gold.
All right, so Miller's going to be asking for gold for Christmas, and he's going to be trying to forge his own sword. I think that's really it for my questions. If any of the viewers have any questions, now would be your time to type out anything. Maybe while we're waiting to see if anything pops up, could you tell us about like your favorite part of the process and maybe the worst part of the process?
Yeah, for me, there's a lot obviously that goes on behind the scenes with making a graphic novel. One of the favorite part is obviously you've got this idea and it's so passionate in your head and you get to writing it, and you get good days and bad days with writing. Some days where nothing flows at all, other days where you're just page after page. Either way, you just feel that passion all the way through it, writing it. And fairly similar with editing it, because you feel like you're getting so close to your script being finished. It's neither here nor there, it's kind of the middling part of the process is waiting for the art to be done and approving art pages, or sending art pages back for editing. That's just kind of middle of the road. But the worst part for me is when it gets to just before the end and you have to kind of compile the book ready for the publisher. And there's all this kind of stress that comes back and forth of like changes that have to happen. And you know that they're right because the publisher obviously has your best interest in mind for the book. But you have that kind of like, oh, I don't want to lose this thing, but you have to lose it.
Yeah, we were chatting about that earlier too, about just how much of the editor's insight really helped you to put it together too.
Yeah, and so like the editing on the script end of it at the beginning, I love it, but the editing at the end that comes from the publisher, I know that their best interest is in mind, like my best interest is in their mind, sorry. And I know that inherently, but I hate having to make decisions on, do we cut this thing out of it? What do we find to put in its place? And just trying to keep everybody happy on that process. Is that sometimes this real fine balancing act that I find quite stressful. And I feel like that on every book. It doesn't really pass. But once you get through that, you kind of see the finished book and you go, that's what they had in mind with it. And that's why we went through that debate on this, and the result is this. And you end up looking at it going, okay, I can see why.
Do you have any advice for fellow writers or just anybody in the literature business, I guess?
Yeah, don't be scared of trying. Just try. If you want to learn how to write for graphic novels, there are resources out there. They're a lot more sparse than writing for screenplays or writing for prose. But there are things out there that you can find. I do offer commissioned tutorials through my Ko-fi page, which is just kofi.com/Mark Allard-Will. And so there are resources like that are out there. And you can learn how to write for script, for comic book script, or you can get the idea of it and just play with it, have fun with it, and learn through each one until you kind of refine the process to where you want to be. But ultimately, don't be afraid to put a product out there in the first place. Like whether it's your own drawn comic book or you want to learn how to work with an artist, just do it to get that experience, have fun with it. Not everything has to be a published masterpiece right at the beginning. You can
take risk and you learn what you learn from it. And
yeah, absolutely.
Either way, it's worth it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you will ultimately be all the richer for the experience because you'll learn how to work with other professionals. You'll learn how to promote a book ultimately as well. You'll learn all the skills you need because, spoiler alert, when you get to be on a publisher, you still have to promote your own work. It's the idea that they show in movies of like, oh, once you're on a publisher, they just promote your book and it's a bestseller immediately. That doesn't happen.
Yeah.
And you have to be on someone like Penguin Random House to be that. And it's like what 1 to 5% of writers in the Western world are on Penguin Random House. So you might as well not look at that and just look at carving your own way in this. And it gets bigger and it gets better with every book. And because this book is doing a lot better for me than other books, but I've had books that have done a lot worse. And so not everything that you see. Sorry, everything that you see from a writer or artist on the public side is the successes. But believe me, we have to learn from failures too. So my ultimate advice is don't be scared of trying. Just go out there, try, have fun, learn from it, come back, try again, learn again, and just keep refining.
Well, I think that is wonderful. I don't think I have anything else for you. Is there anything else that you wanted to share that I maybe didn't touch upon?
Not really. I think we've covered a lot today, and I think that was great actually.
I'm very much looking forward to part 2, and I'm gonna do a little dive into some of your other works. I know there's you have another comic, the Saskatchewan.
Yeah, so that's up on my Ko-fi page. That's that was my first published comic book. So that was a comedy Canadiana comic book set in Saskatchewan, with a superhero whose superhero ability is essentially an ambivalence to the effects of alcohol, essentially.
Amazing.
Yeah.
So if anybody is from Saskatchewan or loves Saskatchewan, it's set in in the prairies. I think that's really fun. There's not a whole lot of Canadian literature, and then Canadian literature in the form of a comic too. Like, that's great.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for chatting with me.
Yeah, thank you, Maddie. I really appreciate this, and thank you to Three Vikings for taking a chance on this book too.
Yeah, of course. All right. Thank you so much, and we'll chat soon.
Thank you. Bye.
Okay. Bye.